West Germany. A young man lies dead on the pavement. His name is Benno Ohnesorg. He was 26 years old. He had gone to a protest expecting confrontation, but not death. A police officer fired a shot. Within hours, Germany had changed. For thousands of young people, this was no longer simply a protest. It became a question. How could a democracy built after dictatorship use violence against its own citizens? And that question would create something far more dangerous than a demonstration. It would create revenge. A few years later, another young woman would walk into a prison. She was a journalist. Her name was Ulrike Meinhof. She had once written against political violence. She had criticized injustice through newspapers instead of weapons. But something inside her was changing. Then came Andreas Baader, a charismatic young radical with an explosive temper. Together, their names would become infamous. Baader, Meinhof, and eventually, the Red Army faction. They believed West Germany was not truly free. They believed the old structures of Nazi Germany had survived beneath a new democratic government. To them, political resistance was not enough. They wanted confrontation. Then came bombs, bank robberies, shootings, kidnappings, prison escapes, and assassinations. Every attack was presented by the group as a strike against oppression. But behind every political slogan were real victims: police officers, judges, business leaders, soldiers, drivers, security guards, and ordinary people caught inside violent operations. The government responded with its own machinery. Special police units were created. Mass investigations began. Suspects were hunted across the country. The courts delivered severe sentences. Prisons became battlefields of another kind. And inside those prison walls, the conflict became even more intense. The militants claimed they were political prisoners. The state called them terrorists. Neither side was willing to surrender. Then came one of the most terrifying moments in modern German history. A powerful businessman was kidnapped. A passenger aircraft was hijacked. A government official was murdered. And an entire nation watched as the crisis unfolded. For days, Germany seemed trapped inside a nightmare. But the most shocking chapter had not yet arrived. Because when the authorities finally believed the nightmare was ending, several major figures of the Red Army faction were found dead inside a heavily secured prison. Official investigations produced one explanation. Supporters of the militants believed something entirely different, and decades later, questions surrounding those deaths would continue to fuel controversy. This is not simply the story of a terrorist organization. It is the story of a generation that believed its country had betrayed its ideals. It is the story of how political anger became violence, how violence created revenge, and how revenge eventually consumed the people who believed they were fighting for justice. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your government is hunting people across the country. Banks have been robbed. Cars are exploding. Police officers are being shot. Buildings are burning. Politicians are receiving death threats. And somewhere in the shadows, a small group of young revolutionaries believes that every violent act is justified. Now imagine something even more disturbing. Some of those revolutionaries once believed they could change Germany peacefully. They were journalists, students, artists, activists, people who attended demonstrations and wrote political articles. They did not begin their journey as assassins. Something happened along the way. Something convinced them that words were no longer enough. To understand the Baader-Meinhof story, we must go back before the bombs, before the kidnappings, before the prison cells, before the famous names became symbols of fear. We must return to a Germany still struggling with the shadow of its past. Because the story of the Red Army faction did not appear from nowhere. It emerged from a society fighting over one enormous question. Could Germany truly become a new country without confronting everything that had happened under the Nazi regime? For young Germans growing up after World War II, that question became deeply personal. Their parents had lived through dictatorship. Their teachers had lived through dictatorship. Government officials had lived through dictatorship. Business leaders had lived through dictatorship. And many young people wanted to know exactly what their parents had done during those years. Some received honest answers. Others received silence. Some were told that the past was finished. Forget it. Move forward. Build a better Germany. But for a growing number of young people, forgetting was impossible. They believed the past was still alive. They saw former Nazis returning to positions of influence. They saw conservative politicians defending the existing system. They watched the United States wage war in Vietnam. They witnessed police violence during demonstrations. And slowly, a dangerous idea began forming. Perhaps democracy itself was not enough. Perhaps the entire system needed to be attacked. At first, the weapons were words. words. Then the words became demonstrations. The demonstrations became confrontations. And eventually, a small number of people crossed a line from protest into armed revolution. Once that line was crossed, there was no easy way back. The first generation of radicals believed they were fighting against authoritarianism, but the methods they adopted would eventually resemble the very violence they claimed to oppose. That contradiction would become the heart of the Baader-Meinhof story, and it would destroy lives on both sides. West Germany was created in the aftermath of World War II. The country was physically devastated. Its cities had been bombed. Millions were dead. Millions more were displaced. Families had been separated, and the moral consequences of the Nazi period were enormous. But West Germany rebuilt rapidly. The new Federal Republic presented itself as a democratic alternative to the dictatorship that had come before. A new constitution was established. Political parties returned. Elections became part of normal life. The economy recovered. Cities were reconstructed. Factories reopened. A new generation grew up surrounded by prosperity. Yet beneath this progress was an uncomfortable reality. Many people who had served under the previous regime were still alive. Some returned to ordinary careers. Some entered government. Some became judges. Some worked in universities. Some became respected professionals. To many young Germans, this seemed impossible to accept. They asked difficult questions. How could someone serve a dictatorship and then simply become a respectable citizen in a democracy? How could a society move forward without fully confronting its past? And why were some older Germans so unwilling to discuss what they had done? These questions became especially powerful among university students. Universities became centers of political debate. Students challenged traditional authority. They protested against conservative institutions. They criticized American foreign policy. They demanded changes in education. They opposed the Vietnam War. And they increasingly questioned the political establishment. The atmosphere was becoming explosive. Then, in 1967, everything changed. The Shah of Iran visited West Berlin. The visit attracted demonstrations from Iranian opposition supporters and German students. Police were present. Tensions escalated. The demonstrations became chaotic. And then came the moment that would become one of the defining images of the radical movement. A young student named Benno Ohnesorg was shot and killed by a West Berlin police officer. Ohnesorg had been participating in a demonstration. He was not carrying a weapon. His death shocked West Germany. For many young people, the shooting confirmed their deepest fears. They believed the authorities were willing to use violence against peaceful citizens. The anger spread rapidly. The protest movement became more radical. And among those watching was a young journalist named Ulrike Meinhof. Meinhof was not an ordinary activist. She was intelligent, articulate, politically engaged. She had already established herself as a respected writer. Her articles criticized injustice and challenged the establishment. But she still believed in political journalism. She believed words could expose corruption. She believed public debate could change society. That belief would not survive forever. Another figure was already attracting attention. His name was Andreas Baader. Unlike Meinhof, Baader was not primarily known as a journalist. He was impulsive, aggressive, charismatic. He had a rebellious personality that attracted people around him. Baader represented a different kind of radicalism. He wanted action, not endless debate, not editorials, not political meetings. Action. The paths of Baader and Meinhof would eventually intersect. And when they did, their differences would become part of what made the movement so unpredictable. One was a writer. The other was an activist who increasingly embraced direct confrontation. Together, they would become two of the most recognizable names in West Germany's radical underground. But their transformation was still ahead. The country had not yet seen what they were willing to do. And the people of West Germany had no idea that a new kind of political violence was about to enter their lives. The first bombs would soon explode. And when they did, the debate about protest versus terrorism would become impossible to ignore. The death of Benno Ohnesorg did not create the radical movement by itself. But for many young Germans, it became a symbol. A symbol of everything they believed was wrong with West German society. The government insisted that democracy remained strong. The protesters increasingly disagreed. To them, the system was protecting authority rather than ordinary citizens. And this disagreement was becoming personal. The streets of West Berlin became a political battlefield. Students marched through the city. Police units surrounded demonstrations. Shouting turned into pushing. Pushing turned into clashes. And clashes produced more anger. The movement was growing, but it was also dividing. Some activists wanted peaceful reform. Others believed peaceful protest had already failed. Among the second group were people who began looking toward revolutionary movements abroad. They studied guerrilla warfare. They read revolutionary literature. They followed conflicts in Vietnam, Cuba, and Latin America. They saw armed resistance as a possible model. The idea was simple but dangerous. If the state used force, revolutionaries could answer with force. If the government imprisoned protesters, revolutionaries could strike back. If the system refused to change, perhaps the system had to be attacked directly. This was the moment when political frustration began transforming into something darker. Andreas Baader became increasingly involved in radical activism. His relationship with Gudrun Ensslin also became important. Ensslin was highly intelligent, emotionally intense, and deeply committed to revolutionary politics. She and Baader became partners in both their personal lives and their growing political rebellion. Another important figure was Ulrike Meinhof. At this point, she was still known primarily as a journalist. She had written extensively about social inequality and political injustice.